In this video, we'll talk about in detail about aggregate demand, why it slopes downward, and what shifts the aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve shows the quantity of all goods and services demanded in the economy at any given price level. That means that each of the components of GDP are influenced by the price level. Notice, I have made consumption a function of prices, investment a function of prices, and net exports a function of prices. The only exception here is government expenditures, which is going to be fixed by government policy. To understand the slope of the aggregate demand function, we must determine how a change in prices affects consumption, investment, and net exports. Let's start with the relationship between prices and consumptions. We call this the wealth effect. As a thought experiment, suppose that the price level P declines. That means that immediately there's an increase in the value of money. Now, consumers' wealth is denominated in nominal terms, so now, because prices are lower, the wealth of consumers has more purchasing power. Of course, with more purchasing power, that means consumers are going to increase spending. That is going to increase the quantity of goods and services demanded throughout the economy. An important side note, the wealth effect concerns the impact of a change in prices on wealth purchasing power, not income. When prices fall, we're implicitly assuming that people's real incomes are unchanged, and we'll only consider the impact of the change in their wealth and their consumer spending. Now let's talk about the relationship between interest rates and the price level, the interest rate effect. Continuing with our thought experiment, suppose again that the price level declines. Then households again are wealthier, or their wealth in nominal terms can purchase more goods and services. As they increase consumption, of course, they also increase their savings. People buy bonds and other assets with their extra discretionary wealth. That increases savings, which reduces the interest rate. If you remember the chapter of unloanable funds market. Those lower interest rates increase investment spending. Lastly, the relationship between prices and net exports. When prices and interest rates decline, investment opportunities abroad become more attractive. This flow of capital increases the demand for foreign currency while increasing the supply of dollars. The exchange rates change again to make the US dollar depreciate against all these currencies. The depreciation of the dollar makes US products relatively cheap abroad, increasing exports. At the same time, an appreciation of foreign currencies makes their goods and services more expensive, relatively speaking, here in the US, lowering imports. That effect increases net exports, eventually increasing aggregate demand. As with every thought experiment until now, the exchange rate effect also works in reverse. So let's summarize. An increase in the price level reduces the quantity of goods and services demanded because of the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the exchange rate effect. Together, they form the negative relationship between prices and real output in the short run, depicted in the aggregate demand curve. So we've talked about how three different effects create the relationship that we have pictured in aggregate demand. So why does aggregate demand shift? Any event that changes consumption, investment, government expenditures, or net exports, except for a change in prices, will shift the aggregate demand curve. Let me repeat, a change in prices won't shift the aggregate demand curve, but it will cause a movement along the curve. Everything else will shift the curve to the right or to the left. Not up or down, to the right for an increase in aggregate demand, and to the left for a decrease in aggregate demand. Now let's test your newly acquired skills. Please go to Top Hat and submit your answers to these questions. Please take a minute before moving on to the rest of the video. All right, thank you for your answers. Let's think about the solutions. For scenario A, a 10-year-old investment tax credit expires. We have to think about what an investment tax credit means. An investment tax credit encourages investment in a particular area of the economy. So when that expires, then the return after tax of whatever investment has decreased, is no longer as attractive as it was before. We expect that to reduce the amount of investment in this particular area, shifting the aggregate demand curve to the left. Now let's think about B. A fall in prices increases the real value of consumers' wealth. This is the definition of the wealth effect, and we know that any change in prices has to move us along the aggregate demand curve. Scenario C. State governments replace their sales taxes with a new taxes on interest, dividends, and capital gains. Well, this one is tricky, right? Because a sales tax is a tax on consumption, and tax on capital gains, interest, and dividends is a tax on investment. So we have two opposing forces here. We know that consumption is going to increase if the tax change is large enough and salient, and at the same time, the investment would fall. In here, aggregate demand can either shift right or to the left or remain unchanged. It all depends on the relative magnitude of those changes.